Welcome to the Women's Money Wisdom Podcast. I'm Melissa Joy, a certified financial planner and the founder of Pearl Planning. My goal is to help you streamline and organize your finances, navigate big money decisions with confidence, and be strategic in order to grow your wealth. As a woman, you work hard for your money, and I'm here to help you make the most of it. Now, let's get into the show. We're rounding out 2025 and have had some exceptional authors on the podcast this year. I actually am pinching myself because they're just books that are big deals, and I have been recommending to friends. And today is no exception. It's actually one of my favorite books of 2024, even more so because it's by a female author in the personal finance realm, and it's on a topic that we all need to hear about: how to retire. So today I'm joined by Christine Benz. You may have heard her name because she is the director of personal finance and retirement planning at Morningstar, and she's a senior columnist at Morningstar.com. She's also the co-host of the Morningstar podcast, The Long View, which I would highly recommend as one of your listens. And this year, she's the author of How to Retire: 20 Lessons for a Happy, Successful, and Wealthy Retirement. We're going to kind of scratch the surface today talking about this book, but I strongly recommend for any of you who are in retirement, approaching retirement, starting to think that it's real, for those Gen Xers like myself, listen to this book, read this book. It's great. And so let's dive in. Christine, welcome to the podcast.
Melissa, thank you so much. And I really appreciate the kind introduction and also the pitch for my book. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Well, the enthusiasm is authentic. I've had conversations with a couple clients who are retiring just this year, and the book went in the mail and we got the thank you because, when it comes to retirement, I think the assumption is like, what is my number? How much do I need? But retirement is so multidimensional. It is a massive change in your life. And you have interviewed experts on retirement in order to delve into this multidimensional perspective. And when you kind of wrapped up the book, you talked about how important it is to be willing to entertain different perspectives. Tell me about this process. Tell me about how you kind of came to that conclusion of this framework for the book and what it meant to you when you kind of pulled it all together with the outcome.
Yeah, I worked with Craig Pierce at Harriman House, the publisher, and we had been talking for probably 5 years, more than 5 years, maybe, about me doing some kind of book, probably a retirement planning book. And I just could not find the time in my schedule. So it was actually Craig's idea to pursue an interview format for the book where I would interview external experts. And I love the humility that suggests, that I didn't have to sit here and pretend that I know everything there is to know about healthcare planning in retirement, or, uh, uh, how to use annuities, or, matters that I haven't focused on very squarely during my work. So the opportunity to interview external experts, who do have deep wells of knowledge in those areas, I thought was really appealing. So I liked how it came together. And as you said, Melissa, I also liked how you had some people who actually disagreed on some aspects of retirement planning, where the perspectives on annuities, for example, were quite different. People like Bill Bernstein and J.L. Collins were, kind of marking annuities with a skull and crossbones. And then you had other people like Michael Finca or Wade Pfau, who were much more positive on annuities. So I think that there are different perspectives across a range of topics, and I liked that as well.
I love that too. I think that actually it's a really interesting question to ask if you work with a financial professional, how you've challenged your own assumptions, brought in and entertained different viewpoints. For someone, using the annuity example, as someone who I was burst into this profession in the late 90s, early 2000s, when really there was a sea change from things being sold as commissionable products to more of a advisory not product sales, but advice. Annuities really have a bad rap, but then academics love them actually because
Right.
they create certainty and sustainability for a certain part of the portfolio. And this is where, you can this is what I love about the book, because I think if you just set out to write, the retirement Bible, it would be inherently a challenge because it would be one point of view. For example, you talk about how cash flow and bucketing strategies is really your sweet spot, where you've dived in, and you're really an expert there. But there are so many different aspects of what it means to be retired, not only for your portfolio, but as a human, that you really have laid in front of us in a way that's very approachable.
Well, thank you. The portfolio construction is another one where, you know, I did talk about bucketing in my chapter of the book, but there are really different perspectives. Like Bill Bernstein is sort of like buy some tips, maybe hold some equities and call it a day in terms of constructing the portfolio. J.L. Collins is in favor of kind of a radically simplified retirement portfolio where maybe you have total stock market, total bond market, and maybe a little bit of cash. So I like that there were an array of opinions on that as well, because, anyone who's saying there's just one portfolio that fits everyone for retirement decumulation, I don't think it's unfortunately quite that simple or clear cut.
No, I agree. I think that it's important to have a point of view and a process and framework, and not being kind of skipping through different, kind of ideas from year to year as kind of the winds change. But I totally agree with you. And another area perhaps of controversy, you interview people, and you're famously a big you're involved in the Bogleheads community,
Mm.
which is from a group of people that are really investing as a culture, and their personal investing, and people that really love that, and implement their investment portfolios themselves. Ramit Sethi also is a big proponent of receiving financial advice, but not having investments be the form of compensation, and not having necessarily implementation of investment strategies handled by a professional. And then, of course, you also are often speaking to professional financial planners, and the work that you do with Morningstar. Can you talk a little bit about this? I mean, to me, there's some people that are ideal for self-implementation, those DIY investors and the bogleheads. There's other people that have absolutely no desire to ever place a trade, who love the ability to outsource their personal investment management. I work with many of those types of people, and people that just enjoy delegating, and somebody navigating complexity. So what do you see? And I just love that they're both perspectives, because I don't think every person is similarly, kind of set up.
Well, absolutely. And I completely agree that it is not black and white at all. In fact, I will say I've come to the realization, even though I spend a lot of time talking to DIY type investors, I've come to the conclusion that most people do need some help in retirement, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's like full on, someone is doing all of your portfolio management on an ongoing basis, maybe not necessarily for certain Bogleheads types, but most people do have some kind of blind spot, some things they understand less well. You can't be an expert in every aspect of this. It's one reason why my husband and I have a financial planner who we work with. We have an hourly financial planner. I'm comfortable managing our investment portfolio, but I recognized that there were some areas where we had questions, specifically in the realm of tax planning related to employer stock, and also to help us sort out the long-term care problem. I didn't want to go to a purveyor of long-term care insurance to help us figure out whether we needed long-term care insurance. I wanted an objective opinion, and she was able to offer that to us. So that kind of thing can be a kind of a medium ground or a middle ground for people. But my my argument is most people do need at least another set of eyes on their plans. And another side benefit for us to having a planner is there's another receptacle of our investment accounts, someone who actually can look at our accounts in real time. If something were to happen to both my husband and me where we were unable to access our accounts or tell our loved ones what we have, well, she's there. She is their person that they could call upon to find out how to pay the bills and all that kind of stuff. So I think that is another valuable sort of layer of protection that people might think about. And that's particularly important as we age. And, we know that the incidence of cognitive decline increases as we age. And, you may run into a situation where you're unable to be that DIYer at some point. And so, yeah.
So interesting. Yeah, I really I am not spending my life's work focusing on this, because when somebody comes to me in their 50s and says we're skeptical about professional kind of implementation, I often do financial plans for those people, but my, kind of the majority of my work is with people that want to delegate. And it's not I don't want to work with you, but it's like kind of a natural friction for ongoing work. But for those people, it's so interesting because one of the most impactful presentations I've ever seen was actually at a Morningstar conference, probably 20 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, talking about diminished capacity in people and how it shows up first, often just in the natural process of aging in terms of indecision and or difficulty in numbers, financial accounts, and things like that. And so, while this isn't my particular area of focus, I think for those of you listening who are those self-implementers, and I love you listening to the show, having a game plan where before you get to that point where you're unable to be decisive yourself, of how you will manage if there is diminished capacity, which often occurs even without dementia, in a long life, is something that is definitely worth thinking about and putting in place before you have an emergency.
100%. Get it at a minimum, get that trusted adult child on board with whatever you're doing. But the gold standard would be probably some objective financial professional, I think. And I think I remember the presentation you're referencing, Melissa.
I need to look it up.
I think it was David Laibson at Harvard.
Okay.
That sounds like one of my hobby horse sessions that I had been like, we need to get this person. And I think it was David Laibson at Harvard who has done some amazing research in this area. It's not an uplifting topic.
No.
None of us wants to ponder that aspect of our lives. But I often think about my dad who experienced cognitive decline, and he had me to be his investment buddy and, to make sure that nothing slipped through the cracks when he went through that experience, when we all went through that experience with him. But not everyone has kind of that adult child who works on investment matters for her day job. So anyway, yeah,
he was
something
pretty
I think
fortunate. Yeah, and I agree. It is a difficult conversation, but it's so much less difficult speaking about it in a time like this where, we're before the crisis. The
Right.
other thing that is so interesting as a practitioner is that some of the best savers, some of the best accumulators really have a struggle when it comes to permission to spend. Like, are you serious? Like, I'm going to be taking money out of my portfolio instead of putting it in. This is just something that is people that are gifted in one side of the equation may not feel comfortable on the other side of the equation spending. In areas of financial planners, the academic research says we may be encouraging people not to spend, discouraging people from spending what they could be spending in some cases for safety's sake. And this is just like a really interesting emerging area to talk about when it comes to retirement because it's a massive shift.
It is. And it's almost perverse to talk about because we have this group of individuals in our country who are quite undersaved relative to what and so this isn't an issue at all. But
you're just going to have to take your Social Security and,
right.
borrow when you need to.
Yeah. Right. But You're absolutely right. With people who have kind of burnished their identities as saving people, as investing people, it's very difficult to make that transition where you're not just seeing this one-way channel of your money going from your paycheck into your various investment accounts. It's going the other way. And I do think it's a huge psychological hurdle. I encountered this in my own household a couple of years ago. We had sold a lot of employer stock,
Uh-huh.
and it had a big tax bill attached to it. Well, I transferred the proceeds to our investment account, and then, the taxes came due, and I'm looking at our sort of household cash flow, and I'm like, oh, we don't have any money. Well, the taxes were over there in the investment account, but I hated the idea of ever touching that, even though, technically, really, the tax bill should have been paid from those funds. But it's a huge psychological hurdle. A couple of people in the book did offer some practical solutions to help people over that hump. Jamie Hopkins talked about the virtue of practicing some spending in those years leading up to
Uh-huh.
retirement while you're still working. Do things like buy the car with cash. And of course, that's good advice today with, interest rates up a little bit. Most people, if they have the wherewithal to buy cars with cash, probably should do that. So practicing some big ticket purchases with cash, I think, is good advice. Getting some training wheels on the spending. And then the idea of potentially, going back to an annuity, that might be another idea where it's kind of this one and done decision, maybe not perfectly comfortable to make this big outlay to buy the annuity, but once it's done, you have that stream of cash flows coming towards you. You don't necessarily have to be going into your portfolio year after year to raise your living expenses. So that's, I think, another idea for people to contemplate.
I'm laughing because I'm thinking of your investment portfolio when you had done that equity compensation sale. Um, and I remember a friend who gave me a cutting board that was wood once. And the day that she gave it to me, she's like, hey, give me a knife. And she like ran a knife across it because she was like, this is intended to be used.
That's
And
so funny. I have a beautiful cutting board that my friend in Napa gave me that is like sitting downstairs, like never to be used at all. So I've got to think about that because I have not been able to get over that hump.
maybe the next cutting board, but I mean, it really is like, sometimes you have people, this is an aside, but in on equity comp they receive RSUs, they get taxed that day, and then the RSUs accumulate and they're like, I've got this big tax bill, and you're like, yeah, the tax bill that came from these guys that you're not touching. Like,
Right.
yeah, that was compensation. Would you have bought that stock that day? But I have to laugh. And I also think that the complexity, it's one thing where you always know you're saving on taxes if you're, kind of maxing out your retirement accounts. When you flip around, especially if you retire before you turn on Social Security and before your required distributions, which are getting later and later, um,
Mhm.
there is so much tax optionality that like are the warm waters I love to swim in that are very intimidating to understand. And so people often oversimplify and just think, I want to turn on dividends, or I'll spend whatever the interest is in my portfolio. And that may not give you the highest quality of life or let you achieve the things you want to do in retirement. So that's one of those areas where it's just like it's an extra level up, that may be difficult for you to become an expert in when you retire, where it may be helpful to have the advice of a professional.
Definitely. The tax dimension of retirement decumulation is a little bit of a mind bender. And I did delve into it with Mike Piper in the book, who is, I
Hmm.
think, really clear about
I love
explaining.
that chapter. Yeah.
Thank you. Mike is amazing. And he talks about kind of levers that you have. And he references specifically that post retirement, pre Social Security, pre required minimum distribution period as
Hmm.
a really rich period to potentially explore some different options, like a series of Roth conversions or maybe even accelerated withdrawals from the traditional tax deferred balances to help kind of reduce eventual RMDs. So yeah, there are things that can be done in that period. And then the whole thing about that you referenced, Melissa, about people wanting to subsist on income. That was my initial attraction to the whole bucketing thing. I was like, so what can we do that is not that, where someone is just trying to live on whatever cash flows are organically generated? And I think the bucket approach is kind of an attractive way to address how to construct cash flows if you're not just going to be exclusively reliant on dividends or other income producing securities.
Absolutely. That is just when somebody's really dug into that philosophy, you can it is so hard to undo the work that has been done to say, I figured it all out. And
Right.
not to say that you can't use that, kind of income paycheck in the mail concept. I'm just saying there may be some other considerations. Have to do a whole episode on dividends someday,
You
dividends and interest
should,
someday.
because there is a lot there. I mean, I'm curious, and I'm going to ask you a question, but like
Yeah.
when you work with clients and they have that dividend paying mindset that they, mainly want that dividend paying portfolio and they never want to sell anything and they really have no interest in bonds as well, typically, or that's been my experience, that this component of, so do you kind of deal with that and use that as kind of the bulwark of the portfolio? Do you say, okay, for this client, we are going to just lean in that direction at least, and do have the equities mainly focused on dividend production?
It's interesting. So I do have one client, I'm just thinking right now, who really loves a dividend focused, separately managed account. And yeah, not a problem. We can fit that in. It's not the entire portfolio and we've made it work, but she's had some flexibility with us in terms of where we distribute funds. So it's not fully funding that paycheck. For extraordinarily wealthy people, it can work. So another client who's very uncomfortable with risk. So don't think dividends, but think CDs north of 10 million in net worth. So it works. And so, no, I don't need to get in the way of that because they, very specifically kind of want to live off of principle. I'm curious about like what that means for next generation. There's a lot of curiosity there, which if someone were willing to dive in, they could go there, but in this case, they don't need to. And, we take it as far as they want us to. Interesting, though, I think most of the people like that, they often come to me for financial planning, don't want the investment implementation because they've read, I can do this myself, which I don't disagree. Many people can. I don't know if it's always an intersection with this group of people. And then very willing to take on equity risk, but then also very focused on the dividends, self-implementing. My question is, because we've had really a very resilient 15 years, very brief interludes of negative returns. But you and I both lived through 2008 and 2009. I think it's one of the extraordinary benefits of being Gen X with, some leg room for the next 10 or 20 years in careers, but also having seen what my younger colleagues have not seen is like what's going to happen when 35% for a year or two, or like, more than 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, in terms of do you just bail and go to cash because you didn't, you needed something that was really locked in framework, especially if dividends go down at the same time. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. And that's what we saw in that 0809 period where the financials, the bank stocks that had been such a huge source of dividends historically cut their dividends in a big way.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like, and I look at my career too, not to get too far off of our topic, but, I learned so much about mistakes that financial professionals make coming out of that and being a part of those mistakes. In terms of, I really feel like at the firm I was working at the time, we were overly conservative at the wrong moments in time, and for a long time coming out of 08 and 09, because financial practitioners are just as likely to have their own behavioral biases and mistakes. And so it's just a really extraordinary, it was a horrible experience to live through. I remember being pregnant with my first child and I could not wait for maternity leave just to be like, get a break from talking
Get
people
out of
off
there.
the ledge.
Yeah.
But also, it's just such
I'm
a valuable
sure.
experience for us to have that perspective, not reading about it in history books or looking at it on a chart, but actually knowing how people reacted to a true, kind of two standard deviation event when it comes to like kind of bad markets.
Yeah. And the mistakes, and we could
Yeah,
do the whole thing on 08,
someday.
09, but institutional investors too. I mean, when we look at like the funds that were created in
Yeah.
response to that period, we saw a huge flood of
Yep.
alternative investment products hit the market. Well, okay, those would have been helpful for 08, 09, but now here we are in, late 2009. Okay, whole bunch of alts. Um, a lot of people talking about tactical asset allocation. What's your tactical
Mm-hmm.
strategy? Lots of new products around tactical asset allocation. Just sort of like fighting the last war, basically.
Absolutely.
Like, right? And we see this again and again. We see, individual investors are often, I think, caricatured as like the dumb money in the market. But I'm sorry, we do see it to some extent with the professional
It's
investor
totally
class
cell
too.
phone. I mean, I that's another great question when you're working with financial professional. What mistakes have you made and how have you adjusted? Because then I get out the litany of reasons I like became more and more strategic, less and less active in terms of the investment decisions and investment, even the investment strategies that we utilize, because that takes away the opportunity for you to outthink yourself and like de-risk into really really bad performance.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful to hear. And I think about like humility. I
Yeah.
mentioned humility before, but like we should be looking for that in our financial helpers. They should be able to say what they don't know, or the things that they just don't care to conjecture about, like what stocks will do
Predicting.
next
Yeah.
year, or yeah, they should have a whole big too hard pile. Like, here's what I don't do, and here are the tried and true things where I think we can really add value. So I like the idea of people asking their financial professionals, what don't you do? Where do you feel like you add the
Well,
most
you're
value?
speaking my language, because one of the things we remind people of at the beginning of every year is, if you hear us predicting, then we've changed our stripes. Not that we're not going to say, I like to talk in possibilities and probabilities instead of predictive certainties. So it's not like we're not going to talk about the future, but people that think they can predict lack the humility and also probably aren't disclosing their track record.
Yeah, no, exactly. I love that idea of dealing in probabilities and possibilities rather than outright predictions. Anytime anyone is saying, something in the near term will come to pass, uh, you know, for sure, I think you need to check it
Well,
out.
you have a chapter. I think a lot of women in investing do have that humility. And you have a chapter from Jean Chotsky, who's done extraordinary work in making money relatable for women, especially, but just in personal finance in general. And it's what women need to do differently. And we're talking about retirement. So, I mean, this is the Women's Money Wisdom podcast. So let's talk amongst the girls for a moment. What do women need to be thinking about differently?
A couple of things, and I love Jean's work. When I asked her what she wanted to talk about for this book, because she's Jean Chatzky, she can talk about what she wants. So I kind of let her tell me. And this, of course, has been such a passion of hers, working with women to improve their financial wherewithal. So one thing we do know is when we look at the data, women are much more likely to be poor in retirement than men. They're much more likely to be reliant exclusively on Social Security, versus having any portfolio assets at all. So a few things that women need to do differently. They need to understand the role of caregiving in their lives and its impact on their earnings trajectory. We know that women sometimes take breaks, and I put that in quotes because it sounds like it's going to be super relaxing, but women, are more involved in childcare oftentimes than their male partners. They are much more likely to be caregivers for their aging
Mm-hmm.
parents. And so women are likely to feel this sandwiching effect much more acutely than men. And that does put a crimp on our earnings power. Women tend to peak in terms of their earnings earlier. And we see that, women are just crushing it in terms of educational attainment, becoming doctors and lawyers and so forth. But women tend to peak earlier because they oftentimes do
Mm-hmm.
reduce their work, reduce their earnings, I should say, earlier in their careers. And then later in their careers, when women are maybe involved in caregiving for their elderly parents, that too can curtail working income later in life. So women need to be mindful of that. I think it argues for if you are a young person, young woman just emerging from college, you really need to hit the savings
Mm-hmm.
hard early in your career if you possibly can, to build up that nest egg to try to get compounding to work for you. Um, so that was something we talked about in the book. We also talked about
Mm-hmm.
longevity and how women are, based on the averages, are likely to outlive their male partners or male counterparts by a couple of years on average. And so we need to plan for that longer life expectancy. All else equal, it argues for having a pretty equity heavy portfolio if you possibly can, because you need that growth potential, especially in your accumulation years. And you also need to lay the groundwork for long-term care because our male partners uh, live a few years shorter than we do, we're more likely to be caregivers for them. But then when they predecease us, there's no one around to care for us. So we need to lay a long-term care plan as well.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. I think long-term care is really interesting. I'm not someone who every person who walks in the room says you need long-term care. I really am anxious about, if you go to someone who sells long-term care, everybody with a heartbeat is a candidate. And so I really do think I that's the only type of insurance business that I do, because I just always feel uncomfortable kind of going to, like I said, someone who's only specializes in long-term care and having people, especially women, sold based on fear. But I do think that that can help with that ability to take on risk in the portfolio if you can show that there is insurance if you're kind of the last one standing. But it is a very personal decision. I have long-term care insurance. You described that could have had that conversation with yourself and your husband. But it's a personal decision. It's not necessarily for everyone. It's very expensive, so you need to tackle that as well.
Yeah, a dimension of it is that it's a peace of mind allocation that
Mm-hmm.
I think, doesn't get represented when you look at the finances alone. But
Yeah.
I
And
think
it's
for people,
complex. It's really not
yes,
like that straightforward. So you need
not
some
at all.
time and you need a consultative approach to really tackle that.
Right, right. And I like the idea of women at a minimum, if they have decided to forego insurance, what's your long-term care plan then? Because I think the odds are like roughly 50-50 that someone will need paid long-term care in their lifetimes. So is your plan that, yes, I'll spend through my resources and then rely on government provided care, or is it that I want to self-fund long-term care, and in which case, well, there are implications for the spendable portfolio that's left, because I think you'd want to kind of hive off that portion of the portfolio because that's your peace of mind allocation. But it seems to me that, people, if they skip insurance, they don't take that next step of and then really think through, okay, then what is my plan in that case?
Absolutely. Yeah, we start just like a practitioner perspective with an assumption of 2 years of long-term care for a couple. It would be for both. We start with an assumption of living till age 95, and then we talk about whether we need to add longevity as well as like kind of forecast longevity. And then we never include the equity in a home, just knowing that, either through, if you stayed in your home, you could borrow perhaps against the equity, and or in many cases, a home is sold and you move to a place where perhaps there's a deposit but higher rent, if you need to kind of transition past independent living near long-term care. But that's an element that is not a warm and fuzzy conversation to begin with.
No,
And so
no.
you really need you need to be realistic and thoughtful when you approach it.
Yeah, no, I've concluded, it's kind of the human condition that we want to assume that the body that we're in today, the mind that we have today, that it will ever be so, and I think a good planner can get you visualizing some of those less happy phases of life. And Michael Finka makes the point in the book that, like, if you actually can visualize some of these things, which admittedly are not fun to think about, you're at least in the driver's seat of the decision making, where you're articulating, to your loved ones, here's what I want. If I should encounter some cognitive decline, I want to stay in my home, or maybe you don't want to stay. But to the extent that you can get ahead of that decision making and articulate what you want, it really, I think, lessens the burden that you're putting on your loved ones to, you're not
Absolutely.
trusting them into making these decisions for you at what is likely to be a stressful time for them anyway. If you can alleviate that somewhat, to me, it's really an act of love. If you can try to get ahead of some of that decision making.
So true. We don't have time to go into it, but you have a great chapter with Jenny Roselle about estate planning, even
Mhm.
just a letter about what, like just your words instead of a legal document to say what's important to you, or a video. I mean, we're recording today in video format, could be something that might be a nice um, touchstone for those that might be your caregivers someday.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. With the softer side of estate planning too.
Yeah, absolutely. The foreword to your book was written by a retirement columnist, Jonathan Clements, who is really a legend in the personal finance journalism field for being very personal, talking about the intersection of money and life. Spent really his life's work kind of preparing people for retirement. Since he wrote that chapter, or that foreword, which was great, he's been very public talking about a terminal cancer diagnosis and how that's impacted his life, his money. It's just really generous and beautiful, frankly, for him to be sharing in this way. I know you're close friends. Could you talk a little bit about how, the first thing I thought when I read his chapter was like, oh my gosh, like just it's kind of catches you knowing his story that he's been so willing to share publicly. Just the perspective of when he wrote that and today.
Yeah, I was so thrilled that Jonathan was willing to write the foreword to my book. He was my first and only choice when I thought about who would be best, who would be my top pick. He's just been such a huge influence on how I think about money and investing, but also such an inspiration to me in terms of, being an amazing human being, and
Mm-hmm.
more recently, being willing to share this personal journey with all of us. I had heard about Jonathan's diagnosis before I actually read his uh, his post on Humble Dollar, where he disclosed that this was going on. But through this journey, he's been sharing with all of us his thoughts on
Mm-hmm.
his imminent, maybe not imminent, but his terminal diagnosis, and uh, kind of just sharing a lot of wisdom with all of us. So it
So
meant the
much
world to
wisdom.
me. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, that's one of the things to think about that I think, kind of brings us full circle is retirement isn't just money. When I think about Jonathan's story, I think about my uncle, Uncle Jack, who was a lover of life and always dreamed of retirement, and he passed away before he retired. And so much about the message in your book is about make sure that you're thinking about the person you will be in retirement, as well as the money. Many of your important relationships may be through work, and you may find that while you think that they'll stay the same, they're different or perhaps lost when you leave the workforce or your workplace. Um, and also, there's certainly a message, just like Jamie's chapter talking about practice, that life doesn't start at retirement. Even if you don't love your job and think, get me out of here, I just want to be sitting with my feet up by the beach. Take care of your current self as well as your future self, and don't wait to live, but also don't assume that a life well lived is easygoing if you've got the money part figured out when it comes to retirement. Um, what are your thoughts on that? Like taking care of that human and really, being present at all moments, knowing that anything could happen.
Yeah, and I think as we age, we naturally encounter more friends and loved ones who are, very suddenly, have some terrible diagnosis or something like that. So you start to really understand the importance of not coming into retirement with this huge bucket list of things that you weren't able to pursue while you were working. I think
Mm-hmm.
ideally we would all try to have a little bit of balance all the way through. And certainly as you get closer to retirement, like 5 to 10 years from retirement, to me, it's so advantageous to think about, kind of the work that you're doing. Try to make it something that you enjoy, that you feel like it's giving you a sense of purpose. I've been talking about kind of the Sunday night calendar test where you look at your week ahead, as most of us do, where you see things on your calendar and you're like, oh, yay, I get to do that. And you're looking forward to it. And then you have other things on your calendar where you are a little less enthused about them. Can you kind of use that as food for thought to determine how you're progressing in work? Can you subtract some of those things that you don't enjoy as much, pull forward and keep maybe doing longer the things that you do enjoy more? And I've just come to be a big believer in kind of phasing into retirement very gradually in that way. And I do think that for a lot of people, continuing to work at some fashion is the right answer, where if they can find aspects of their work that are agreeable, maybe it's not 40 hours a week. That's a lot of time to give to an
Mm-hmm.
employer, but maybe it's fewer hours, more agreeable tasks. And, maybe you're kind of getting more of what you want in terms of work-life balance, where maybe you aren't commuting anymore, but whatever, rather than thinking literally about, oh, I go from 40 hours to 30 hours to 20 hours. Do you think about all of those things when you think about the nature of the work that you're doing?
I love that. And I can speak personally, having a very fulfilling, achievement oriented early career, and then getting to a milestone where I had a list of things I wanted to accomplish. The listed, then I was sitting on top of that mountain and it didn't necessarily feel that good. And pivoting, changing, starting a company, and not necessarily in the early years having the monetary rewards that I had been grown accustomed to. In fact, I've had practice using my investment portfolio as I started my new venture, my in Pearl Planning. Um, and but the purpose and the meaning, the alignment, I did that switch from an hour each way commute to 5 minutes where I can, leave at 8:45 and make a 9 a.m. meeting with plenty of time to make coffee. That is a gift, and don't wait for the life to craft the life that you dream of until a certain retirement point. It may be that it was worth it to start earlier, or just integrate different decisions into your current life.
Right. And they're not necessarily the most remunerative decisions.
That's
There are some
okay.
trade-offs. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Christine, I love the book. Again, it's How to Retire. And like I said, I've been giving it to clients. It's going to be on our year end to read list. And it's also just like having female voices in our profession is so important. It's kind of a desert out there, especially when it comes to book publication for great voices that are women. So kudos, congratulations, and keep up your amazing work.
Melissa, right back at you. I love what you're doing here, and I've loved talking to you today. It's been an honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Christine. Thank you for listening to the Women's Money Wisdom Podcast. If you found value in this episode, the best way you can support the podcast is to forward an episode to a friend or leave a review. Go to pearlplan.com and the podcast link to get all the resources and links mentioned.